Hannah 9, September 2nd, 2039 AD. Interest in the spirit in general had waned as time went on, as no further video evidence of his existence surfaced, but Hannah still had loads of subscribers and most often didn't even have to do the footwork and reach out to people anymore. The survivors were coming to her to tell their stories. She even set up a studio in her new house, which was now 2 years old, in which to conduct her interviews, and had a cameraman and an editor on payroll. More importantly, the Society of the Spirit had formed around her. Many members fought to have it named the Society of the Shadow Man, but in the end, it was decided that since Shadow Man was not necessarily his name, but that he was most certainly a spirit, the former would be the name of their collective. In the beginning, it was populated solely by those who had been saved by Daniel Dwyer, but in the 8 years since the formation of the group, more and more regular skeptical people had joined. As time went on, eventually the number of members who had never witnessed the spirit in person had outgrown the number of those in the group who actually had. They were so numerous that they started to have to rent out bigger and bigger venues to hold their sessions, and eventually the members decided to reach out to the public as well as pool their own resources to actually build their own meeting hall. When the society created an online account asking for donations from the general public to fund the project, it quickly became apparent that interest in the vengeful spirit had not diminished so dramatically over the decade, because they met their goal of $500 million within 4 months. And so, the historic building that would later be repurposed as the first church of Daniel Dwyer was built, the Hall of the Society of the Spirit. They met twice weekly, and they did more than simply hear of people's experiences and share stories. Much philosophy was often discussed, or rather preached, in the Great Hall. The dogma of his edicts were being established and without his direct involvement. Most often, one among the congregation would reveal to the pews their experience or thoughts, and then Hannah would take center stage to discuss their story and what it had meant, always certain to bolster the notion of the Spirit's righteousness. Only a few hours' worth of footage survived of Hannah leading the congregation. Most of her analyses of the various members' testimonies were lost. Unfortunately, when she disappeared in 2045 and others headed up the society in her absence, the majority of videos that people had captured of her speaking on stage in the Great Hall were recorded over by the new representatives. In several of the surviving pieces of video footage, her now famous mural, "He Saves," could clearly be seen hanging on the wall behind the altar upon which she stood. 52 of the 75 survivors depicted in He Saves were members of the society at the time. Hannah continued to live off of the money earned by her website and absolutely refused to profit from the society, and she would allow no one else to profit from it either. All were welcomed within the walls of the hall, regardless of their ability to contribute, and she would only put the donation jar on the altar when the expenses were due and only kept enough in savings to maintain the hall for no more than 6 months at any time. The society really took off when their meetings started being televised in the year 2036. And when she made it possible for people watching from home to donate to the society, she would so often receive such an outpouring of aid that she would have to divide the sum of the donations, deducting that which she retained, and return sometimes half or more of every portion that which was donated to the person who had contributed it, and would still have a surplus of money enough to pay the bills for several months. She did not ask for contributions often, only when they were needed, and when she did, she got them in multitudes. She had turned 60 earlier in the year and was still a remarkable beauty. She had received over the years at least 400 or 500 marriage proposals from members of her congregation at home and abroad, mostly from people she didn't know the first thing about, just out of the blue, some 50 or so with actual engagement rings. She did not date anymore, period, so none of the proposals were anywhere close to realistic, being that even if she were available, she would most certainly not marry any person without having dated them first. To each and every one of them, she had said the same exact thing. "I am already married to the Spirit and to the light he brings from the darkness. I cannot marry another, but thank you." The sermon was long over, and all but a few of the staff had gone. As Hannah was preparing to go home for the evening, leaving only a few environmental services employees and janitorial crew behind in the Great Hall, she was chipper. The services were flowing and well performed that day, and she was all the more proud of herself for having done so well yet again. She said goodnight to the crew and was just about to depart the hall and go out the side door that served as the employee entrance and exit when she suddenly heard a clatter outside the chamber doors. Someone was trying desperately to get in. From the sounds of the shrieks and cries heard from beyond the wooden double doors, it sounded like a woman in distress. Whoever it was that was outside, they were flailing at the door handles and pushing and pulling on the doors. Everyone stopped what they were doing, and all of the workers looked in the direction of the public entrance. Hannah went to the doors and could hear very clearly the pleas of a crying woman from without, so she opened the door. The hysterical woman fell to her knees inside the threshold of the lofty doors and grabbed one of Hannah's hands, clutching it tightly within both of hers. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hair was matted down, and she was barefoot. Hannah didn't see an unfamiliar car in the lot and deduced that she must have walked to the society hall. She was trembling and had a look in her darting eyes that betrayed how truly panicked she was. "Thank God it's you," the woman said. "You have to help me. You're the only one who can help me." Hannah helped her to her feet and kept an arm around her as they walked inside. "What is your name?" she asked. "Kennedy," she said, wiping the slobber from her chin on her sleeve and starting to calm down. "Okay, Kennedy." Hannah sat her down in the front pew and said, "Tell me what happened." She was having another bad day. It seemed like Jacob would not stop crying. She knew that he was teething, and that with teething there's a lot of discomfort, but she just couldn't handle the crying. That alone was driving her to her breaking point. She herself cried many times that day and yelled at her little boy more than once out of frustration, not because of any wrongdoing on the part of the infant. She didn't want to hurt him, but she knew how much happier her life would be without him, for he had cost her, among so many other things, Justin. Justin was the one who stepped in when Alex stepped out, and though he wasn't the biological father of the child, throughout her pregnancy he was there for her. He was her boyfriend. He used to talk about how they would raise Jacob together, and that he didn't care that it wasn't his baby, and that he would still love it. But when the pressures of early parenthood started to set in, Kennedy found him gone more and more frequently, and it seemed like whenever they did have time to spend together, Jacob always got in the way. It was like he had sex radar, and if it was going on, he would wake from a dead sleep to put a stop to it. She found herself apologizing to Justin more and more frequently, and found that she was more and more alone more and more often. When Justin severed ties with her and named Jacob as the cause, saying that he just didn't think he was ready to be a dad, what she heard him saying was, "You are not the girl I fell in love with. You are not fun and happy. You are just a miserable, housebound mother anchored to a life that I don't want. If you didn't have Jacob, things could be different." That was nowhere near what Justin had actually said, but it was her subconscious interpretation and the logic which justified in her mind what she would do. She didn't want to do it, but she felt like she had to. She felt like if she didn't kill the baby, she might even kill herself. That's how unhappy she was. She didn't want this life anymore, and it seemed like there were only one of two ways out. And though somewhere in the sound mind she had saved away, she knew that Justin would never be with her again with or without Jacob, it didn't stop the cascade of her infanticide thoughts from becoming an impulse, then an act. If he had loved her, he would have stayed. She should have known that, but somewhere in her sleep-deprived, mangled, and depressed mind, she thought that killing Jacob would mean getting Justin back, getting her old, happy life back. So she filled the bathtub with warm water and cried softly as she held him and whispered her goodbyes. She was very hesitant and sat on the bathroom floor, crying softly, holding him for a good 10 minutes in contemplation. Then he started squirming and burst out in a sudden, shrill, deafening cry, as was his way. The sound of that cry is what did it. Her face went flat, stoic as a marble statue, and she put him into the tub, stifling him mid-cry, much to his surprise, and she pushed him under by the shoulders and held him there. In the resumed silence, she started to pity herself again and started weeping as she pinned Jacob to the bottom of the tub, looking into his eyes through the clear waves and ripples. Then an arm, black as night, reached into the water from beside her and grabbed a hold of one of her wrists. She turned to face the dark shadow as it pulled her arms out of the water, followed by the choking, screaming 7-month-old. Kennedy was so filled with emotion, it didn't seem that there was room for fear, and she didn't tremble at the sight of the spirit as she might have any other day. Instead, she experienced an indescribable whirlwind of every feeling she'd ever known. Her baby had been saved from her, and she just then understood how wrong she'd been, and her tornado of emotions came to a head with sudden euphoria as she realized how grateful she was that her baby had been spared from its death by her hand. She realized in that moment how much she loved Jacob, despite his internal fussiness, and as the spirit, holding the screaming child in his left arm, raised its right arm to gaze into the ball it held, his fingers nearly completely sunken into its surface, she started to say, "Thank you." All that came out was a chirp, as just as she was going to speak, Daniel in one swift move shifted the baby into his ball-ended hand, grabbed her by the throat, and slid her effortlessly up the slippery sliding and into the tub. He held her down face up, seeming to look right into her eyes from where his eyes would have been if she could see them. He held her down and watched her just the way she had done to Jacob, only he did not cry for her. She kicked and thrashed and tried to pull herself out of the water to no avail. She grabbed it where his fingers were wrapped around her throat, but felt only her own neck. He held her under the water until she lost consciousness, but he did not kill her. When she awoke not a minute later, she was lying on the bathroom floor, having been placed there by the spirit, and her Jacob was gone. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Kennedy," Hannah said, rubbing Kennedy on the shoulder with a comforting hand. "You've had quite the traumatic experience." Kennedy stood and clutched at the front of her shirt, twisting it in nervous tension. "But you can help me find him, right? I mean, you know everything about the spirit, right? You can help me find my Jacob." Hannah stopped rubbing her shoulder abruptly and instead gave it a pat, and then she turned and started pacing in the aisle between Kennedy and the altar. Then she said, "I most certainly can help you, Kennedy," which made Kennedy's face light up momentarily before her hopes were dashed immediately. "But you will never see your son Jacob again." In a scorned voice, the woman, still wet from her encounter, said, "How is that helping me?" "It is how the Spirit wills it, Kennedy, and the Spirit sees all," she said. "I assure you that your son will live a long, happy, and fulfilling life in whatever place the Spirit has taken him. I cannot provide you with any proof of this, but I have faith that he wants only what is best for your Jacob, and that he has delivered him to it. He cares for all people, and he will care for Jacob too." "But this just happened 10 minutes ago," she said in a somewhat defiant tone. "They must be nearby, right?" "It doesn't matter," Hannah told her. "Like I said, I'm sorry for your loss, but you will never see your child again." "What makes you so sure?" she asked, desperation seeping back into her voice and on the verge of tears once more. "Because," Hannah said, "you are the 7th young mother in as many years to come to me with the exact same story, and not one of them has seen hide nor hair of their missing child since the day that they were saved from them." Kennedy was lost for words and just stood there defeated. "3 of them are members of my congregation, Kennedy," she said. "A few years ago they formed a support group to help each other reason what's happened in their lives. That's how I can help you, Kennedy. Join the Society of the Spirit for our next meeting and I will introduce you. You may think that no one else in the world can understand your pain, but they can. You may think that you are alone, but you are not. The Spirit has already helped you in such a way as can never fully be appreciated, in that you have changed for the experience. You understand that, don't you?" Kennedy still didn't know what to say, so said nothing. "No child will ever fear for their life from you again," Hannah said. "Your future children, should you decide to have any, will most certainly be safe from the fate that you intended for Jacob. You are already a better person for the experience, you only have yet to realize it. Join the Society of the Spirit, and you will learn so much of how he is transforming lives every day. He has been frequently sighted as far west as the Pacific coastline and as far east as Colorado. One day he will blanket the world in his grace. Kennedy, one day all of the children of the world will be safe. Be with us here at the beginning. You know now that the Spirit is real beyond a shadow of a doubt. Ask yourself, Kennedy, what does this knowledge mean to you? What will you do with it?" She joined, and from then on, Kennedy never missed a meeting of the Society of the Spirit if she could help it. She was young enough that she would survive to see the Society's conversion into the Church of Daniel Dwyer, and be counted among the very first Dwyerists. She would, during his rise to power in the decades following his death, even go on to become a fairly prominent figure in his church. Hannah Dunn had quite the gift for persuasion. Daniel Dwyer had nearly drowned her and had kidnapped her child, and Hannah had her worshipping him inside of a week. Lylan 7.2, October 22nd, 535 AD. Mckeever had been called away from the celebration to commune with the wise men, leaving the mingling tribespeople to revel without her around the large fire they had built in the center of the village. The wise man's mud brick hut was on the outskirts, almost out of view of the celebration. Her father watched as she was led away by one of the wise man's disciples and felt at ease with her leaving as he discussed the seasons with the chief of the peaceful tribesmen. He did not have reason to suspect that it would be the last time that he would see his eldest daughter, nor reason to believe that she was in any danger at all. He had been advised earlier in the evening that the wise man would be sending for her during the night's festivities only once he'd had enough time to prepare for a ritual he intended to invite her to perform with him, and her father had consented. When they discovered later that she was missing and that the wise men had been killed, the friendly chieftains remained peaceable, content to decide between them that whatever had happened to his daughter and their wise man must have been the will of the gods, for footprints, tracks of a god, were found near the wise man's hut, and so they parted friends, believing that a god killed the man and had either taken or eaten the girl. The peace lasted until the famine of the following year would make beasts of them all. When they reached his hut, the wise man bade her escort to leave them and return to the party. Mckeever understood some of what he said, but there was no chance at an effective dialogue between them. It seemed, though, that as he spoke not to her anyway, but was perhaps uttering recitation of some ritual words, and he frequently closed his eyes as he spoke them. Only a few words common to their dialect stood out. The word for dark was used several times, as were the words for thanks and goodbye, but she didn't really know what he was saying. There was a wood carving of a humanoid figure that had the look of having been recently painted on the floor between them. As she sat on the floor across from him, she looked at the little totem. She was facing the back of the little figure, and it looked rather plain. She had through his own eyes seen him carving it, but hadn't been paying close enough attention to remember what it looked like in detail. She remembered only that he had carved it with an overabundance of eyes in its head, 12 sets of them to be precise. Just as she was beginning to get bored and uncomfortable, he began speaking louder, and he started waving his arms around in the air, which startled her 3 seconds before he started doing it. Then he picked up the little totem and presented it to her atop the open palms of his outstretched hands. His eyes were closed, and he was rhythmically nodding his head, and she went to reach for the totem, but just as she motioned toward the offering, she stopped. She saw the hut fall over, and then it fell over, having been suddenly lifted from the back, and she had to roll to avoid being hit by debris. She saw the giant, Hemhut, standing behind the wise man, having knocked the hut over, and then she actually saw him standing there, and the hut was toppled and collapsed. A loose brick and much gravel and dirt fell on the wise man, knocking the totem from his hands, but he did not open his eyes. He ran his hands along the floor until his fingertips finally found the totem, and he lifted it again, gesturing for her to take it, seemingly unconcerned by the fact that his hut had been uprooted or that he was bleeding from his scalp from where the brick had hit him. Mckeever was unscathed. She looked up in awe at the giant and stood. The giant reached for her temples over the wise man's head and said, "Hello, Lylan." At just that moment, the wise man made his move. He swiftly pulled the little wooden stake from the bottom of the totem where he had concealed it and blindly lunged for her. It goes without saying that Lylan has a knack for timing things just right, and she very fluidly turned her body to avoid his attempt, then quickly and deftly snatched the little wooden weapon from his hand, twirling past him up to Hemhut, and plunged it into the wise man's heart 3 times in 3 different places with ease, quickness, and precision, before casually letting it fall from her hand to the floor. As she passed the wise man, she whispered in his ear in mid-twirl, using the dialect of the wise man and his tribe, a language that had been unknown to Mckeever, the one who sees through many eyes. She said, "I am sorry. Die well." Then she looked up at her giant and said in English, "Hello, Hemhut," even before the wise man had the chance to realize what had happened to him. It had been practically painless, but the wise man was bleeding furiously from where she had punctured both ventricles of his heart, bleeding mostly into the pericardium, the lining of tissue that encases the heart. Within a few seconds, the blood-filled pericardium was under so much pressure from the added fluid that it no longer allowed for ease of movement, and his heart strained to beat. He opened his eyes, but he never turned to look at the girl who had bested him or her destructive visitor. He accepted defeat and died on his knees without saying another word. He had failed. Violin climbed up Hemhut's lowered arm like a tree and planted a kiss on his cheek on her way up to her perch. "That way, my love." She pointed into the distance beyond the sloping starlit hillside, and he walked in the direction his love had bid him. No one from the party noticed what had happened among the ruckus, and it would be several minutes before the wise man would be discovered dead amid the ruins of his crumbled hut, still balanced upright on his knees. Mckeever was gone. Her father would never see her again, nor would any Nehoigan for that matter. In reality, her disappearance from the tribe would prove to be of little consequence, as their people would be completely wiped from the face of the earth in short order. The coming apocalyptic event was nigh. The world was about to undergo the darkest year in recorded history, literally. Brother would be forced to turn on brother, desperation driving the blade. "I didn't want to have to do that, Hemhut," Lylin said from her perch as they left the village behind. "He was one of the last of our people. There are not many of them left. I feel so divided in my passions, my love. I cannot both help our people and hope to defeat the demon, yet it so saddens me to see them disappear from the future with every change that is made. By forcing my hand, he has completely erased our people from existence and replaced them with his own." "That is sad, my love," he said. "I wish you could see it, Hemhut," she said. "The way that he treats them in this future. He cares for them like pets, and he keeps them as children, and they adore him. The world as we speak is being reborn in his image, Hemhut, and the demon spawn now greatly outnumber those of the original bloodlines of man. By the time he is born, they will all be gone, every last one of them. It will be a world of people that should never have been." "I am sorry, my love." The giant gently turned, Lylin crawling along his length in unison with his movements, and he began to scale down a cliff, gliding down with his queen on his back. "Don't be," she said, staring off into everywhere. "It wasn't your fault, my love." They journeyed on in contemplative silence down to the base of the cliff. Then Hemhut broke the silence as he resumed walking. "Where are we going?" he asked. "We have a strange journey ahead of us this time, which will take us many places, but there need not be so many dead in our path this time if you so desire, my love. A massive volcanic eruption, already on the precipice of inflicting its wrath, will send the whole of Earth into great famine for years to come. 2 more massive eruptions will occur late in the coming decade as well, and the whole of the planet will become colder as a result. Future historians will refer to the coming century as the late antique Little Ice Age, but this coming year is the worst of all. Many living historians will write in the coming age of how the sun shone nowhere but as if from behind a veil, and gave no light or warmth in the year 536. It will snow during the height of summer in China next year, and agriculture will fail around the world as frost covers their fields. My visions are funneled when there is so much death, and it becomes very easy to see who we must save and who we must stop for the coming generations to carry on as they must." "That is good," Hemhut said. "Yes, it is," she said, "and it keeps us from having to kill so many more." "It is ironic that we are only reprieved from having to kill so many because they now die unaided," Hemhut said. "It seems the very planet has joined you in your conquest of this Daniel Dwyer, and has become itself a vessel of vengeance against his children. I have never heard you speak of any of these impending eruptions before. The earth has become a weapon at your command, my love." She smiled and laughed and climbed down to his forearm to stand with him. "I love you, Hemhut, but no. The reason you didn't hear of them before is not because they were circumvented on the path to our utopian world, silly. I can't stop a volcano from erupting any more than I can cause one to erupt. Some things are inevitable, my love, like the coming of the demon. The reason you didn't hear of the coming disasters and plagues and famines is because along the road to paradise I simply kept the people abreast of what they would face, and helped guide them so that they would be better prepared to endure whatever was coming, and arrangements could be made in advance to ensure the prevention of widespread death. There would have been no plagues, as I would have ensured the cessation of their transmission before ever they'd been given the chance to spread beyond one man, and we would have had simultaneously worked to rid civilization of both the vermin who often served as carriers for plagues and diseases, and the poor living conditions which often attracted them and put the little bringers of death within such close proximity to man. It seems that being bereft of knowledge of tomorrow has made them complicit in the abuse of their resources. They feast when there is no famine, Hemhut, instead of preserving the abundance in anticipation of the next. They live in the moment now. Without me to guide them, they will only suffer, for it seems that with no one to lead them into the future, they are content to simply repeat history, and human history is bleak. "There is to be another plague, Lylon?" he asked, ever facing forward, ever moving forward. "Yes, and very soon," Lylon said. "Like I said, dark times lie ahead for mankind. In just 5 years' time, while still under the grip of the easing cold, the bubonic plague will rear its ugly head again, this time known as the Plague of Justinian, so named for the Roman emperor of this time. What we do next is instrumental in the course of this plague. We must kill 7, 5 in the Porta Palisium in Egypt, who will have spread it where it must not go, and to people who must stay well. Then 2 more in Constantinople who must die, and will not on their own. The man in Constantinople must not be allowed to father children, Hemhut. His pregnant mistress must die as well." Hemhut didn't say anything. "Don't worry," Lylon slid down to lie in his arms. "I'll do it. I won't ask you to kill any more pregnant women, my love. I will kill the 3 of them." So they did as they must have until they were done, and then enjoyed the few days they had remaining together in the unruined wilds beyond sight of man, until Lylon told him to go, that the demon's eyes would soon set upon them, and it was time for her to die again. They said their loving farewells as she watched her giant recede from view. Then she said to him, "Until next we meet, farewell, my love." And she reached up with her little 9-year-old hands and twisted her head until her neck snapped with enough force to sever her spinal cord, and the body of Mckeever, daughter of the chieftain of a doomed people, fell to the ground half a world away from her people. Lylon was gone. Hemhut was alone.